So welcome Mariana Zafeirakopoulos to SINS22. Mariana is a former federal law enforcement public servant and made the move to the private industry to explore transdisciplinary and participatory approaches to co-design practice in strategic, emergent and complex contexts. And Mariana is currently undertaking a PhD exploring knowledge co-production to create more desirable futures in national security contexts. And I will hand over to you without further ado, Mariana, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Roba. Welcome to my presentation on calling in the system. My presentation, I guess, is a bit more conceptual. I want to put out the idea that we might be able to explore more relational ways of knowing for thinking about secure futures in different ways. And I'd like to begin quickly with an acknowledgement of country. And I'm connecting you all from our city campus, and I want to acknowledge the people of the Eora Nation. Given that this is a transdisciplinary focus, I actually wanted to begin by attending to the title of my presentation. This is scholar and activist Loretta Jane Ross, who talks about the frame of calling in culture as an important consideration of the human rights movement as a way of teaching justice. And the idea originally belongs to Lowen-Tran, and it was put forward as an alternative to calling out culture. And you may have come across this term before, the idea that we post or verbalize or tell people how they should behave when their actions don't necessarily align with our own morals or our own view of the world. So the approach comes from a perceived realm of expertise, that we know the answers about how we should be in the world. And it's been quite an interesting concept for me to think about and engage with as part of my own practice in design as a former law enforcement person, working on problems that range from domestic violence, sexual assault, harassment, and it was quite present for me. I was compiling this talk on how we deal with emerging national security problems. And so you'll hear me talk a lot about complexity. So quickly, because it is quite conceptual, my talk, there are three points that I'm going to cover. How do we currently think about national security problems? What are the limitations and what might some alternatives be? So I draw my thinking around different problem types from Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework. Many of you may already be familiar with this concept, but the Cynefin framework has been around for quite a long time. Its origins have evolved and draw from systems thinking and complex systems thinking. But Dave Snowden in 2010 put together this framework. It's evolved several times, as I mentioned, but it's drawn from the Welsh word habitat, and the idea being that there are different types of problems. Not all problems look the same. We've mentioned the word complex a few times over the course of our SINS engagement today. And so national security problems are actually quite nuanced and I think belong in these camps. I apologize, but my computer seems to keep flicking forward to the next slide and I don't know why. So to come back to this slide here, there are some chaotic problems. For example, the September 11 attacks that require in-the-moment novel practice, usually founded on some past experience of what works in the moments of chaos. We have obvious problems. One where we have standards and best practice for something. So it could be a problem that we know a lot about and have done routinely. This could be something like securing physical infrastructure or cybersecurity systems. So this is the realm of best practice. We've got standards in place for this. It's not to say that the problem is easy, and I think it's important to call out that we shouldn't confuse obvious problems for easy to solve problems. It's got its own difficulty, but we know that they're obvious because they're familiar to us. We know that the solutions work. We then have complicated problems, and an example of this could be an evolving diplomatic incident between an Australia or a Pacific or Asian neighbour. It could be about protecting against foreign interference or bribery and corruption. There may not be best practice standards for these problem contexts, but there are good practices that we can follow and existing principles based on experience. But we recognise that depending on the context, those lines might be a little bit blurred, pardon. And then we land on complex contexts. We don't have existing practice to draw from in this space. We don't have best practice or good practice. We're learning and experimenting and probing as we go. And it's a more action research approach. And I mean that in the broadest sense. So an example of this, I could argue, could be the role of artificial intelligence, as we've talked about today, how we build trust with citizens, which is where my question came from. Thank you to Dr. Shivani for attending to that. When citizens engage with these moments of data breaches, what happens to their privacy? How do we rebuild that trust with the technology? And importantly, you may have already noticed this, but it depends on how you view a problem that determines what camp it might sit in. So indeed, a problem like terrorism prevention or cybersecurity might have within it dimensions that sit across all features of the framework. But who in the system is solving these challenges? Who's got the responsibility for it? This is clearly a very simple, incomplete cross-section of the system. We all have different roles to play. Some of us are advisors or influencers, informing our decision makers, giving them options and probability around risk and harm. Others of us are liaising with community and implementing some of these concepts and ideas. But what I observe, or I guess part of my argument, is that we see how the system grapples with this challenge, and the national security system, those who operate in it, have a really good handle of dealing with problems that I argue fit quite neatly in those complicated, obvious, or chaotic frames. We've got practice and analytic approaches that we know work quite well. My own home discipline is that of intelligence, and I argue that by nature of its analytic approach, we tend to confine the problem and reduce it or try to understand the components. And so consequently, and importantly to a degree, the realm of objectivity, cause and effect, it dominates our approach to how we think about these problems. And those norms are quite strong. The challenge with this, though, is that it doesn't really fit the realm of complex problems. The realms of expertise has limitations for emergent practice, because what we know in the past doesn't necessarily work for what we see emerging or see coming into the future. And there are a few tensions, aporias as I call them, that are present for me, I think, when in my research and in what I've seen and what I've been exploring as part of my PhD studies, that we know that the logic of creativity has place for all the different problem types that I talk through in the Cynefin framework. But information recognized as a science means that we often reject this logic of creativity. We know that creativity and thinking more openly is important, but it's not necessarily endorsed or seen as a valid approach in the same way as objective or the perception of objective science is. We know that positivism as a way or a paradigm of thinking is effective for known and knowable problems, but we know that often in our national security space, our problems are ever increasingly emerging and complex in the way that Professor Kuhn talked about, where we've got food security connected with critical infrastructure and health. These systems are interconnected and interrelated. And so increasingly, it's very difficult for us to draw the boundary around a safe space and stay within that camp. So our dogma, our norms, the way that we practice our thinking in these problems is an analytically focused, but by nature of that analysis, it's reductionist. We take that system and we break it apart and we look at those individual components. But for emerging futures, we need to look at the whole system. We need to look at the impact of the system and the relationships in that system, which is more about a sense-making approach and involving the public in ways that perhaps we, national security contexts, don't necessarily engage. A couple of other tensions that I see, the way that we frame up our problems and challenges are reinforcing. The language of national security is often around risk and harm, but if we look at interventions that are about risk reduction and harm reduction, we don't shift the problem. And so we end up staying in this loop of how do we stay ahead of our criminals or our cybersecurity threats when we're always feeling potentially as if we are in the back foot. So I say these points not to say that there aren't good things that are already going on in this space, because there are absolutely wonderful incremental changes that are occurring in the national security context. But my overall argument is that we're not fundamentally shifting the problem, because it's quite difficult for us as a government, as a people, to look and work across a whole system. Which brings me to, I guess, my last tension, which is that we've got quite entrenched and stable national security training for our intelligence practitioners, our policy practitioners, but our contexts are shifting and other disciplines are really trying to look at these problems in different ways. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from transdisciplinarity. Which brings me to what are some of these interventions. And in this diagram here, you can see that individual disciplinary approaches work quite well for some of these more obvious problem types. Here you can see the language of simple problems, which refers back to one of the former iterations of the Cynefin framework. But when we're looking at more complex problems, we need the melding and the merging of different disciplines to come together to generate new frameworks or new thinking, new fundamental shifts about how we understand the problem space. And that's what distinguishes transdisciplinarity, at least for me, from other research approaches. So how might we call in the system? What might a more relational aspect between our disciplines, between our community look like? And I guess this is just an invitation. Of course, there are going to be caveats and limitations on some of these principles that I'm offering to the group for your consideration. But I do think that embracing sense making as a way of thinking about national security challenges and the way that people make decisions in that space or inform decisions in that space is really important. So a shift away from trying to draw boundaries or reduce and reduct a problem down into manageable components, because that's innately human. That's what makes it easy for us to grapple with, but trying to lean into some of that challenge and difficulty by thinking about how do we look at the connections between these problems. I think there's also opportunities to embrace more interpretivist and constructivist approaches. We know that, at least in the intelligence profession specifically, more objective paradigms dominate, but starting to think about what lived experience or human experiences are relevant and legitimate ways of understanding a problem is something worth thinking about, which lends itself to my next principle about knowledge co-production. How do we understand national security challenges together? How do we co-produce that knowledge? And when it comes to knowledge co-production, that's about, as we begin to co-evolve our understanding about what solutions could look like, so does our understanding of the problem space evolve. So it's this constant journey. And that in itself is a creative form of problem solving. And being able to recognize that as its own form of rationality, I think, is important. I think often in our teaching, our training, even in our dialogue and research, we talk about creativity as this separate process that's not logical or doesn't have its own structured way of engaging, but actually it does have a form of rationality to it. So embracing it as something that is equal to disciplines of science, I think, is something that would be interesting for us to think about. Finally, to this point around social impact and involving the community more, how do we call in the system? In order for us to be able to create the futures that we want, we need the people who are benefiting from these futures to be part of that conversation. So continuing to fracture this thinking and engagement around problems that we're trying to solve means that our trajectory to the future is going to be an extension of where we currently are, rather than trying to rethink or reframe the futures that we want for ourselves. So with that in mind, I want to leave you with some questions to ruminate on that might help us start to think about the system in a different way. What would it be like if we started to have some different dialogues around national security as a transdisciplinary system? What if national security was more inclusive of communities to help shape desirable futures together? What would that look like? What if we framed national security as a system of caring rather than a system that is more about offense or defense, more of this opposing concept? What would it look like if we had additional functions in national security governments that perhaps were responsible for thinking about designing and strategizing new frames to emerging problems that are specifically around the futures that we as community want? And just leaving it on this idea of what does public involved look like, not just being kind of passive recipients to the national security system, but what does a meaningful engagement look like, noting all the caveats around why it's difficult to share information with the public, but where are those opportunities, trying to unlock ourselves from why it wouldn't work, but what does a system that work look like? In short, I guess to conclude and to try and wrap up in the interest of time, when I think about this concept of calling in, it's really about a relational way of knowing that opens dialogue, that allows us to explore problems in new ways together, but importantly, recognizes lived experience and the human experience. And that, in a way, is a different, perhaps an alternative, I'll say, an alternative to the current dominant thinking about national security complex problems, which tends to be more reductivist, more analytical, and situated within the realm of expertise and solutions and certainty. And as we've heard from our numerous presentations today, this emerging space of the role of AI technology, we know that there's a lot we don't know, there's a lot that's changing. So for us to be able to create the sort of system levels change that we want, I really feel like a relational approach as opposed to a more incremental approach is something worth considering. And I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening, and to keep the conversation going, as a Dr. Shabani, I'm also at UTS, and there is my email address. There was my email address. I will stop sharing, and thank you, Rova, for the opportunity to speak with you all today.
Thank you so much, Mariana. What a presentation. That was absolutely phenomenal. Before I turn to Professor Kathleen Vogel from Arizona State University, I just wanted to say that those were some incredible questions, Mariana. So many important concepts, of which I really like the concept of calling in the system. It reminded me of the work of Donella Meadows, actually, as you were talking about systems thinking, calling in the system, the idea of systems wisdoms that can possibly be, I guess, added to your idea of calling in the system. So how do we get the beat of the system? How do we think about mental models? How do we honor, respect, and distribute the different forms of information and ideas around language, which you brought up, in addition to, moving away from those reductionist approaches, also thinking about what's good for the whole, and listening to the wisdom of the system. So I thought it was really interesting the way that you framed that, a really valuable contribution to this workshop and to this session. So thank you so much.